I am Shimon Casey, and I am here reading the historical notes section from Lars D.H. Hedbor's latest book, The Oath. From the text, it reads, "As usual, I have done my best to adhere to the history that can be known from the records, both official and unofficial, that survive from the incident that forms the heart of my story. Sadly, few official records remain of the chasseurs volontaires of Saint-Domingue who came as part of the French force that tried, and failed, to retake Savannah, Georgia, from the British in 1779. After it achieved independence a couple of years later, Saint-Domingue took its modern name of Haiti, and its history since then has been plagued with misfortune, both man-made and natural. Most salient to the work of writing a convincing story of those brave volunteers, the National Archives burned, blew up, and burned again on no less than 3 separate occasions, meaning that most of what we have today to document their involvement at Savannah comes from reports and records of the American and mainland French forces they served amongst. All of that said, I have knowingly played fast and loose with the historical record in a few places. I always figured it's better to tell on myself than to wait for a more rigorous historian to raise objections to my fiction on the grounds that it is unrealistic. First of all, the sequence of events at the trenches in the days immediately following the American arrival was somewhat different from what I've depicted. In order to build up dramatic tension, I wrote a relatively slow escalation of encounters with the British, culminating in the feint which tricked the Allies into firing on one another, which did happen, tragically, and then the disastrous ambush outside the trench under construction. In fact, the major ambush, in which the French forces and the chasseurs volontaires specifically suffered terrible casualties even before the disastrous assault on the British emplacements, took place first, making the confused intramural fighting even more horrifying. While the ingredients of the rum oath were based on real oaths taken, particularly amongst the enslaved at Saint-Domingue, the details of the oath are largely of my own imagination. Under the circumstances that the characters were working, though, it made sense to me, and it certainly moved James's story forward in a compelling way. The capture of a large British detachment, which records of the event claim consisted of anywhere from 111 to 140 men, plus 2 armed sloops and 3 merchant ships, by means of clever ruses at Colonel White's direction, happened largely as described. My characters engage in some slight exaggerations, of course, but there is no doubt that it was a boost to the morale of the besiegers and a blow to the defenders trapped within Savannah. The aftermath of the battle on October 9th, 1779, was every bit as awful as I've described, and though I hesitated to include the gruesome details on that afternoon, the fact that it marked the bloodiest single hour of the American War of Independence demanded that I honor the memories of those who lost their lives by declining to turn away from the carnage. The story of Sergeant Jasper's exploits at the defense of Fort Moultrie at Charlestown makes a brief appearance in the Declaration, and, like my characters, I was surprised and saddened to learn of his demise in Savannah as I wrote this book. I thought that his gallantry and devotion to ensuring that the symbols that inspired and hardened the Americans fighting at both of these scenes of the American Revolution were worth mentioning. Desertion from both the French and American forces was a constant issue in the days and weeks following the failure of the Allied forces to retake Savannah, although I found no real evidence that the deserters were motivated by anything but the desire to exit the fight, having experienced some of the most horrifying battlefield scenes of the entire Revolution. I have no evidence that there was a serious discussion about pressing into practical enslavement the men of the detachment of the chasseurs volontaires who were sent from Savannah with the American forces to care for the wounded. However, I do know that one of the senior officers present at Charlestown was Henry Lawrence, yes, of Hamilton fame, who decried the failure of South Carolina law to permit the raising of a black regiment in that state in a letter to Washington. Had any proposal been raised to reduce to brute labor the detachment from Saint-Domingue, I trust that Lawrence would have sprung up to quash it. General Lincoln, the commander of the siege at Savannah and the defenses at Charleston, did complain bitterly in a letter to Washington about his inability to demand provision of slaves, the only laborers in this country, from the plantations in the area. So I probably have been too charitable in my depiction of his response to this imagined argument between his officers. Given that, at this writing, we are well into the second year of a global pandemic, it is only surprising that it took this long for smallpox to make a substantial appearance in one of my stories. The smallpox epidemic that raged across North America at the time of the Revolution was a larger military factor earlier in the war, particularly during the Northern Campaign of 1776, until General Washington's now familiar and highly controversial decision to order inoculation for all Continental troops. Unlike modern vaccination, which stimulates an immune response by presenting the body's immune system with some inert or greatly weakened element of the infectious agent, smallpox inoculation involved introducing a sample from an infected person into a small cut in a healthy person's skin, infecting them with the full-strength smallpox virus, but in a manner that, for reasons still poorly understood, did not manifest as the full-blown disease, usually. Because of small risk of contracting the disease itself, and the more serious risk of transmitting it to others while recovering from the inoculation, the general's order was opposed by many, but it succeeded in reducing the smallpox epidemic as a factor in the military calculations as he tried to counter British moves across the entire eastern seaboard and beyond. That is not to say that there weren't outbreaks from time to time, however, and as depicted, not all militia units adopted the Continental Army's inoculation practices, leaving their soldiers vulnerable if they did come into contact with the dread disease. In healthy patients, smallpox would kill between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3. However, as with any grave illness, those who came into their fight with the smallpox virus already weakened by wounds or other diseases fared much worse. It is a cruel irony of history that the same men who lost so much at the walls of Savannah were immediately tasked with the doomed defense of Charlestown. Having undertaken siege warfare from the offensive side, they then had to endure it in the role of defenders. The terrain around Savannah gave the advantage to the British, as did the quality of their leadership, compared to the leadership of the Allies. At Charlestown, the advantages of terrain were reversed, as the British were able to take possession of the high ground to the west of the town, and use that commanding location to lob cannonballs, and, by the end of the siege, superheated hot shots into the city, leading to the outbreak of fires. Further moves cut off supply lines from overland and by water, so the American position in the city was impossible to maintain. The surrender of the force at Charlestown was one of the most severe outright defeats that the American side suffered over the entire course of the war. I found it relatively easy to conceive that the close contact between American forces and the gallant chasseurs volontaires would have left some of the Americans deeply aware of the humanity of the enslaved blacks who labored in bondage, even as the new nation congratulated itself on having established liberty for its citizens. I don't think it's a great leap, then, to think that some of these soldiers would have gone on to take part in the burgeoning abolition movement in the early part of the 19th century. While I don't have direct evidence of any of the veterans of the Revolution claiming their pensions for the express purpose of devoting the proceeds to the movement to end slavery, it's almost impossible to imagine that none did so. Those pension records, though, are a rich source of research material both for historians and fictionalizers of the Revolution. Because they were required in order to claim pension benefits and had to be presented as accurate under oath, they are some of the most detailed and reliable first-hand reports that we have of the experiences of ordinary soldiers.